Welcome, welcome, welcome to the first English-Speaking Union happy hour of our third season. We're kicking things off with Frederic Schwartz, longtime member of the English-Speaking Union and the Washington, D.C. branch. I'm, as always, Joshua Keppel-Gonzalez, Director of Branch Services at the English-Speaking Union of the United States. As ideas for these lectures come from you, our members and viewers, please share any ideas or topics for any upcoming speaker or talk using the survey that will appear at the end of our program tonight. Before we get into that program, I wanted to make a couple of technical announcements. As opposed to our more common setup, this will not be a dedicated, there will not be, rather, a dedicated Q&A section at the end of this presentation. Instead, questions will be answered as they are submitted. So please, if you have a question for Fred, please enter it into the chat or Q&A module. Buttons to access both of these are located at the bottom of your Zoom screen if you're on a desktop or a computer. You can do this at any point during the presentation, and we'll get to the questions as they come up. I also wanted to take a moment to recognize the branches with the most registered members for this happy hour, and those are the Atlanta, Nashville, and Central Florida branches. Now, to really start us off today, I'd like to welcome Happy Hour Committee Chair, Karen Blair Brand. Karen?
Thank you, Josh. Let's see here, something in, okay, now it's gone. Welcome, everybody. And again, as Josh said, this is our third series of the Happy Hour brought to you by our branches and our members of the English-Speaking Union, and along with our talented Josh Keppel-Gonzalez and our leader, Karen Karpowitz, who allows and helps us provide this opportunity to our members all over the United States and internationally too. Folks can kick in along with friends and guests as well. I have a opportunity today to introduce to you a longtime friend of the English-Speaking Union that I met through my husband, who was a member of the DC branch and a former branch president, Robert Brand. I met Fred back in the late 90s. And so I've known him almost 25 years, almost a quarter of a century. But he's been a member almost more than twice that long. And Fred is a longtime lawyer in Washington, D.C. As if you read his bio, you know he started out in Boston. And he'll tell you his journey through the ESU of around 60 years. I also have known Fred for a long time in travels through the ESU for national meetings. And my second home is Washington, D.C., where I have a lot of friends, including our past honoree, Dr. Marjorie Williams, who's no longer with us, but did make it past 100 years for her century or centenary of her own life. Fred has known her for a long time as well. And so we go back a long time. One little note that maybe Fred can talk about, Fred and his wife, Jill, they live in a lovely condominium in Washington, D.C. in the Watergate. And I'll let him talk about that as well. And so welcome everybody to ESU Happy Hour. And again, the years, Fred will depart many different pieces, great pieces of information that'll be so interesting for you. So sit back, relax, and enjoy the next hour of ESU over the past 60 years. Thank you.
Good evening. Despite all my efforts to sound like Alistair Cook, I can't quite do it. But welcome. We are in at her, and it's the organization I've belonged to for the longest. And I've just got a sign saying my internet connection is unstable. And I need to say it is probably no more unstable than I am. So I hope you enjoy this without too much of an interruption. I know you're probably wondering whether I'm trying out for Charlie's aunt, the way I'm dressed. There'll be an explanation for this. There'll be an explanation for most things I say, but I've asked that when you put something in the chat, that I be asked directly. And I don't mind being corrected. I've been a lawyer for almost 60 years, and there are many, many judges who have managed to correct me with impunity. So don't be concerned. However, this is a cocktail hour. So I am about to have a drink of sherry, a habit I picked up when I was at Oxford when I went there in the summer of 1964. I suspect many of you may not have even been born in 1964. Nonetheless, it's an excellent habit. And I've managed to maintain it. I think I need to give you a little bit of advice. It's not everybody that drinks sherry. The kind I drink, and hopefully you can see this, is called Listeau. It's called Listeau actually in France. I don't know what it's really called in England, but it is imported to England, and it is pretty famous and pretty well known there. There is something called sherry that comes from California, but I need to warn you, it's counterfeit. Do not drink it. There should be a notice on the label. This is not sherry, this is pretend. Well, let me get on to my adventures. As you saw from my bio, I went to the Oxford, and as I've said, I went to Oxford in the summer of 1964 to study metaphysical poetry. And my tutor was a distant relative of William Wordsworth, the poet. However, he was pretty certain that he could find some way of mentioning that at each tutorial, just to keep me in line. But it was a very amazing experience. One thing that I did was play croquet on 400-year-old grass. And you think that we've had our bicentennial not that long ago, you can imagine how wonderful 400-year-old grass is. And that too is going to find a place in what I'm going to say later on. Just a little bit of insight. Turns out metaphysical poetry is, for the most part, written by lawyers. And while I wasn't even dreaming about being a lawyer yet, it made sense to me. Now, there was only one problem. That is, when I returned to university, I asked for credit for this course. And they asked to see the grades I got. And I explained that they don't give grades at Oxford. And they said, well, we don't give credit without grades. So they wrote a letter to Mr. Wordsworth, which was his name as well, asking for my grades. And he responded something to this effect: Mr. Schwartz is rather clever. And the university registrar felt that that didn't quite translate to letters and numbers. So she wrote back to, I guess in this country it would be Dr. Wordsworth, and said that she was pleased to hear it, but nonetheless, she needed a grade or a number. And he responded, Mr. Schwartz can be humorous on occasion. And once again, she wrote to Mr. Wordsworth saying, that's what I've heard, or words to that effect. Nonetheless, we need a grade or a number. And she would not allow me to see his response. But she did evaluate it, even though it was not a grade or a number. as a B-. When I returned from Oxford, I got a letter from the Providence branch, and it was a 4 or 5 page letter talking about the goals of the ESU and the benefits of joining, and a very reasonable price for people my age. And so I joined. And I joined because I had never gotten a letter asking me to join anything, not even the Boy Scouts. So I joined, and they assigned to me their youngest member. It's sort of my guide. And he was a charming and erudite English physician, somewhat in his 60s, I believe. Now, I can't remember the Providence branch doing anything, but I assume that they did. And nonetheless, the fact that I can't remember it suggests that it was in the English-Speaking Union tradition of one dinner and one annual meeting. I hope nobody belongs to the Providence branch and is now rapidly writing in the chat section that, in fact, they do a lot. It would be nice to know that they still existed, and my only recourse is to say, they may do a lot now, but they weren't when I was a member. My job was assigned to me in the branch. It was to find younger members. And this was a theme that was assigned to me in all the branches I was at, until I became too old to find younger members. But I know that I was a failure at the Providence branch. And I suspect that I found less younger members than the people I convinced to vote for Goldwater in '64. Now, another theme that runs through the from the Providence branch through the other branches I belong to is we are very precise in terms of our language. When we talk about a fundraiser, it is defined as an event that we don't lose money in. And that was known to occur an unfortunate number of times. After university, I went to Boston to go to law school. And I joined the Boston branch. And in many ways, the Boston branch was the opposite of the Providence branch. First, they had a clubhouse on Commonwealth Avenue in a relatively fancy part of town. And it had a bar, which was where on Fridays, we had cocktail parties, and which we called open houses. And it gave us the opportunity to meet, for the most part, relatively acceptable, for the most part, youngish, for the most part, members of the opposite sex. And this was an enormous draw. There were very few older members, but there might have been on a Friday night 100 members. They'd all be this, at least in their minds, youngest and more attractive. The English-Speaking Union has always had a reason for joining. And in this instance, it was to meet people. Prior to this, in the 50s, the English-Speaking Union put together tours to go to England and other countries. And this was before deregulation in the airline industry and before you could get a reasonable price. So the English-Speaking Union played very popular, and it was the reason many people belonged. However, by the time I got around to becoming a member, it was relatively cheap to fly to England. Now, the Boston group was a pretty lively group, and they engaged in some highly unusual activities. One I remember is a flight to Marbella and spending time at in essence, a British colony there. And the reason for this, the cornerstone of these activities, was the branch's executive secretary, Biddy Butt. She was relatively young, although I wasn't prepared to ask her her age, and she wasn't prepared to tell me her age if I asked her. She was relatively attractive, very personable, and up for almost anything. And so the activities were exploratory in kinds of English-speaking union activities. But as I say, the main draw was Friday night cocktail hours. And I note that this is a cocktail hour, but it's not Friday. I later ran into her at in Washington at the 50th anniversary, I believe, of the English-Speaking Union. The annual meeting was held in Washington. And unfortunately, it had not been warned about the Washington press. Because if you're talking to a reporter and you're from Washington, you know that the first thing you say is, "This is off the record, of course, isn't it?" And then they're obligated to keep it off the record unless they ask permission to go on the record for a quote. And of course, it was a big deal, 50th anniversary, and it was well covered by the papers, including the Washington Post. Well, Biddy didn't know about how to do this. She didn't know about the rule. And consequently, she didn't invoke it. And she said some very, very interesting things about the people that belong to the English-Speaking Union, relating to their age and their interest and the ESU. And since the reporter she said it to was Sally Quinn, who some of you may know about, others of whom should go to Amazon and get some of her books because they're quite good. But at that time, she was a social reporter. And she considered her job to be one of a social reporter who could cut people off at the knees, and she often did. So she put it in the lead. And I think it might even been in the headline of the story that she wrote. Biddy was advised by a member of the ESU at the time, who was an assistant secretary for a department which I will not name, the assistant secretary for public affairs. And she was told, just deny it. Everybody thinks that Sally Quinn makes up this stuff anyhow. And I have to say that the member who told her, along with his wife, I believe moved to Central Florida and was a member of the branch. I suspect he's no longer alive and can no longer sue me, but nonetheless, he was the advisor to him. After I left Boston, although not as a result of my leaving Boston, the Boston clubhouse closed, the branch moved to Waltham, and if anybody is from Boston, they know that moving to Waltham is a near death of any organization. I also think they have a penitentiary there. Now, while there still is a Washington or a Boston branch, it's pretty peripatetic, and its activities are at various sites throughout Boston. But it is a wonderful place. Boston is a fantastic place, and I would recommend that if you want to go on a holiday, you should go there. Well, in 1968, after I graduated from law school, I went to Washington. And it was a heyday of the Washington branch. There were around 2,000 members, which is a remarkable number. And more importantly, the entire Commonwealth lay at our feet with an ambassador to speak, an embassy to party at, an opportunity to do things that, frankly, no other city could match. And so the ESU branch in Washington took full advantage of that. I used to say that, and still do really, that there are 3 goals of the average ESU member. The first is to go to a place where they're not usually invited to go to. And the embassies fit in very nicely with that, as did the State Department, which made its rooms available for ESU events. The second is to have an opportunity to meet somebody who you would not normally have an opportunity to meet. And again, the embassies were very important in that. And we also had a very strong program, which now exists in some branches, called English in Action. And in English in Action, it would be, as many of you know, a one-on-one session with somebody who wanted to improve their social English, right, and idiomatic English with a member. And it was a remarkably successful program. And as you notice, and I was pleased to notice on the little cartoon you saw in the beginning, that meeting people is one of the privileges of the ESU. It's something that needs to be continued and is being continued. And to those of you who want to get something from the ESU, let it make an introduction. Let it help you meet somebody who you'll remember probably for the rest of your life. And you will have made a contribution to friendships and understanding around the world. And that's hard to do these days, unless, of course, you're President or Secretary of State. And if you are, please call me, because I've been trying to contact you on something for ages. In any event, in Washington, there were 2 cadres. There was the usual cadre of older members who were in every branch. And when I was in Washington, they were World War II officers, former diplomats, such as Karen's late husband, elderly Anglophiles, a few who were looking for social prestige, and a Cuban spy. Now, the Cuban spy is the only interesting one in the group. Turns out she had joined the ESU because she believed it would be a conduit of information that she could send to Cuba. Her big mistake, and she probably didn't get a chance to make a second one, her big mistake was writing and sending the information to Cuba in a regular envelope and leaving her return address. So the FBI arrested her, spoke to us, reviewed her dispatches to Cuba, and decided that Cuba could get more information from the Washington Post and didn't jail her or bring her to court, merely sent her home. So there is now living in Cuba, maybe not, a former member of our Washington branch, because when she arrived home, she was younger than I am, is probably married and raising a family, or they shot her for being truly stupid. But in any event, whatever is left of her is now in Cuba. Now, the older members look forward to 2 events a year. The first was the annual dinner party with the British ambassador. And there are many members who ate out at dinner just for the opportunity to be able to say, well, last week I had dinner with the British ambassador. And let me just give you an idea what it was like. We have a program, English-Speaking Union, Washington branch, annual dinner. Its mission is essentially the same, to draw together in the bonds of comradeship the English-speaking people of the world. This was the annual dinner at the Willer. And it was in honor of the Right Honorable Sir Esme Howard, GC, BG, CM, GCVO. And by the time you got done saying that, you were further down on the line meeting him. And Lady Isabella Howard. Presiding was General Henry T. Allen, who I'm former military type, as I mentioned, who was president of the English-Speaking Union. Grace was by Right Reverend James E. Friedman, and there were several speakers of not any particular note. The menu was interesting. Started with strawberries. There was bisque of new asparagus saucier, which is of course a soup. Celery hearts, olives, salted almonds, which we were supposed to use to entertain ourselves till the food came. Supreme of bass, potatoes, followed by fillet of beef with fresh mushrooms, Florida peas, whole hominy, and tomato and aspic with cheese wafers, and then fancy cakes, macarons, and mince, and coffee. And I would have actually enjoyed this dinner, except that it happened 13 years before I was born on April 22nd, 1929. But this menu and this dinner and these participants could have been when I was a member, and it could have been into this century. Same, not the same people, but the same type of people. And let me just tell you a little bit about who they were. We're talking about 1929. This program, by the way, came from a bookseller called Lizzie Young in Newport. And there was a branch in Newport. And there was a lot of traffic between the branch in Newport and the branch in Washington. The British ambassador was ambassador to the United States from 1924 to 1930. He didn't wait till I was born. Presiding over the dinner, as I say, was General Henry T. Allen, president of the branch, known for his exploration of Alaska in 1885 an extensive military service. He would die 4 months later, hopefully not from the 48. Grace was given by the Reverend James E. Freeman, the Bishop of Washington, who officiated memorial services for Warren G. Harding, Woodrow Wilson, William Howard Taft. And that gives you an idea of the background and how people thought about the English-speaking. Top flight, top flight. Then we had an annual garden party at the British Embassy. And that was mainly for the older members, although all the women got to wear their fascinators. It pretty much followed the same process. The process was you wore your fascinator, you listened to a steel band, you ate small sandwiches and strawberries, and then you left and told all your friends. Well, I was at the British Embassy the other day. Now, there was also what was called the Younger Members Group, YMG. And since we had a clubhouse, and we had a wonderful clubhouse, there had to be the same kind of Friday parties you saw in Boston. We called them open houses to avoid the Alcohol Control Board. I was a lawyer then and devised that scheme. Too late to arrest me. The statute of limitations is run. My job was to think of events which garnered press and use the riches of the environment around us. The most successful, believe it or not, was the English-Speaking Union annual croquet tournament. And it went on for 25 years. We had our own rules, which looks like this, although now they're pasted together. And it advised when a ball is not dead, when it's out of bounds, and so on. Now, we did it essentially to get press. And it worked. Here are some clips from 1972 and 1974. And these are just 2 years worth. But we knew that just having a croquet tournament would not be enough. So we had 2 croquet tournaments each year. The first croquet tournament was a competition with the press. The people you saw who won were the editor of the Star, which was our evening newspaper, a reporter from the Washington Post, and TV personalities. And because there were TV personalities, it became one of the light kickers of the year. A light kicker is when, and they may, I don't even think they do it anymore, but at the end of TV news shows, they used to have a fun piece about how this happened, how they found a dog or a dog found somebody. But one of the light kickers was our croquet tournament. And it was remarkable how many angles their camera people could get to shoot a croquet tournament. They lay on the ground. They put their cameras on top of the wickets. They put it on top of the post. They shot through the legs of their whoever their person might be. But eventually, they ran out of ways to shoot the croquet tournament. And after about 15 years, they stopped doing it. And the press tournament just ended. But for another 10 years, people who really played croquet continued to play. And then it just didn't work anymore. But it was remarkable to see an English-speaking union event, a croquet tournament in front of the White House. And some of you may know what you think is the back of the White House. Most people think it's the back of the White House is actually the front of the White House. And what you think is the front of the White House on Pennsylvania Avenue, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, is actually the back of the White House. But we won't go into how that happened. Nor will we talk about how the British burned the White House. That's a different kind of lecture by somebody who knows a lot about it. But that wasn't the only major event we had. We had a regatta for canoes on Potomac, and had such events as the Denizen Dip, limited to Indians, and the Politician Pull, limited to people in Congress. And so on. Here's a question for me. Oops, I've lost it. Josh, can you put it back on again? Let me go.
Let me tell you what the question is.
Yeah, tell me what the question is.
How did the Boston and DC branches financially support and sustain physical clubhouses?
In Boston, I think the clubhouse was actually rented. And so they sustained it through dues. In Washington, we owned it, and we got a note from National and used it to buy. And so there was a note to National. We were paying it off using dues over decades. And unfortunately, we decided it was too expensive to keep up. And so we sold it, and then the person we sold it to went bankrupt. And so we only got part of our money, but not all of our money. But that money sustained us for many, many years. I thought it was a mistake. What cemented us, what positioned us, as I tell my daughters when they're quite young, that the most important thing in marketing is positioning, and don't forget ancillaries. And for the ESU, having a clubhouse with events and a bar was remarkably important. And I just see a note from one of my daughters, Johanna, who is a filmmaker in London and has made one film that's had national distribution about Malian music called They Will Have to Kill Us First. But here's from my other daughter who concurs and is the head of a division of the company which advises people, I won't mention the name, advises people on marketing. But it's nice to know my children are listening to this. So, let me say one additional thing about the croquet tournament. And if I'm able to do it, I'll show you. This has had a little bad luck. But this is tournament trophy. There are actually two sides of it, but if I show you the other side, you will just crumble at my feet. But this And each one had their name engraved, winners. And everything was fine. And yeah. Star in the Post did very well for maybe 10 years. And then there's a minority newspaper which is very well written in Washington. And one of its reporters is a former basketball star. And so they sent that former basketball star to play. And he was able to swish hoops, which was remarkable. And he won 5 years in a row. And then I gave him a trophy, retired him, because people were grumbling. Now, during my time in Washington since 1968, in the younger members group, there were lots of things that we did that deserve mentioning. But the advantage we had was that everything was close by. We had, let me just give you a sampling, just to let you know the variety. The Smithsonian Institution, we had an exhibit of plates from a British butterfly guide, which to me sounded like really something nobody would go to. But apparently, butterflies, and particularly this unique book which talks about British butterflies, was very important and resulted in a significant visitation over a large room with the original plates. We had a Caribbean carnival with Barbados, who joined with us in doing the event at the embassy. And I almost gave up sherry for rum, which of course was made available since Barbadian rum is probably the best. And the embassy didn't mind giving it to us. And I think I may have a bottle still, but don't tell. We went to the Indian embassy. And some of you actually may remember that. I think somebody from Nashville went. And I'm pretty sure somebody from Atlanta went, because that's where my wife was raised. And she spoke to that person. Who, even though it was the Washington branch, wanted to go to the Indian embassy. And it was a wonderful event in an old Washington mansion. And if you liked Indian food, you couldn't have done any better. We had multiple events with Canada, and we were an important linkage, actually, for Canada as it began to be recognized in this country. It's hard to believe, but for a whole year during the last century, for a whole year, there wasn't one mention of Canada in the New York Times. We sponsored a bilateral meeting where Canadian mid-level government and executive types came down, or US went up. And we had serious speakers. One of our speakers came down from Canada with a very important TV type. He was so important, he was considering running for president of Canada. I'm sorry, premier of Canada, I guess. And when he came down, we had lunch before he was to speak at the Lawyers Club, which is about 5 blocks from where he was to speak. And so we were going to walk, and then we walked over to his speech. And he was used to being identified by everybody he passed in Canada. They were always asking for his autograph, I'm told. And he was just about as well known as, say, Walter Cronkite. So he was walking down, going to the meeting, and nobody knew who he was. And he started really puffed up. And by the time he got to the meeting to give his speech, he was totally deflated. I don't think it affected his speech, but it was a remarkable sight to see. With the UK, we had many events as well. Probably the most important ones, or the most important one, was the Student Congressional Parliament Exchange. We had college students from the UK nominated by the ESU, International ESU, and they got internships in the offices of congressmen and senators. And then we sent over a crew of people to Parliament, and they in turn ended up being interns in Parliament. And the people I spoke to afterwards said it changed their lives, literally changed their lives, changed the way they looked at things, changed the importance of things, changed how they viewed themselves. And these activities are also terribly important and are carried on by the ESU even today. This particular program is not, but it's one of the ones that we hope to have resurrected soon. And this was also a product of the Washington branch. But we had, as I say, garden parties, and I've talked about the other events. We have had events with the Corcoran Gallery of Art, which unfortunately is now closed, but we brought over an art show from Leeds. We flew it over. It was at the Corcoran Gallery, then it traveled up to Philadelphia, and I believe Providence as well. The only problem was that it came from the faculty of the art school in Leeds, and when they heard it was going to be flown over, they decided to send the piece they wanted most to go down with the plane. So it was a mixed show, but it was beautifully hung in Washington and I hear elsewhere. But the point is that having that show and being associated with that show was enormous. Here's another one.
So I'll go ahead and, well, I think there's two, but I'll start with the James Spavely one. Is that if there is one branch program or activity of the past that you would like to bring back, what would it be?
That's an excellent question. And I guess the answer is, I would like to bring back new activities relating of a similar vein. For example, I would like to have a speech contest centered around Frederic W, who is one of the greatest speakers in this country, if not the greatest speaker in this country, and have it open to people to come to Washington, have local contests, then have people come to Washington and compete. I would like to have the congressional exchange brought back because I think it was terribly important. But most of the activities which are lost or which have ended because they're just worn out. And so I have a file which has maybe 10 activities, which we hope to bring back.
And I think, just so you know, that we do have two people asking pretty much the same question, which is, what about the gold clothing? And please tell us about the gold garment you're wearing. It's fascinating.
Okay, interestingly enough, that was the next thing on my list. As I said, I'm not trying out for Charlie's hands. We had a very close relationship with the Folger Library and the Folger Shakespeare Theater. For the Folger Library, we had a number of events, a number of projects, including sponsoring a scholar at the Folger Library and special tours for our members and so on. As for the Folger Theater, Shakespeare Theater, they have a perfect reproduction of the Globe, and it's built right in the library in Washington. And if you come to Washington, I certainly would recommend that you take a tour. And they had at that time a theater company, and that theater company and the ESU had annual events in conjunction with each other. We would buy out the theater for a theater event, and we would go to the Great Hall of the Folger Library, which was a duplicate of the Great Hall somewhere in England. And we'd have dinner. And in doing so, I ended up perfectly honestly, with 2 costumes from the Folger Theater. This is just half of the costume of the king, Richard, or one of the Richards, or one of the plays. And so that is the gold tunic, and there's another piece that goes underneath, but it is really hot in Washington, plus the fact that it takes a while to figure out how they got it on. So the gold costume I'm wearing, rather strangely, the gold costume is in fact the tunic that goes on top of the English king's costume. So that is the answer to what I'm wearing. Then another event that is quiescent, but which is not dead, is we established the English-Speaking Union Award for and we tailor the end of it, depending on who we gave it to, and then said the English language, like promoting or representing or something like that. And we gave it, because it's Washington, we gave it to really important people. Just to give you an idea, we gave it to Dan Forston, who's written many books and was in the Librarian of Congress. We gave it to Stacy Keach, who is the well-known actor. And what people don't know about Stacy Keach is that when he started off in Shakespeare and studied Shakespeare. We gave it to William Sapphire, whose column in the New York Times many of you have read. We gave it to Bob Woodward, and we gave it to other people, all of whom very generous in accepting the award, made little speeches. Interestingly enough, Bob Woodward, who I would think would just sort of slough it off, gave the best speech, a serious speech. And of course, we had other speakers. For example, and this is my favorite, Harold Evans. Harold Evans was at one time the editor of Times of London. He was an author of books on writing. He was an author of books on history, and he came to Washington, came to the States to become editor of the Weekly. And so he spoke to the ESU, and I, during one of my 2 terms as president, and I do have the distinction of being removed from the presidency twice. And fortunately, it's the end of the program, so I don't have to explain why. But I had the honor of introducing him. And I believe there should be an introduction. It's not just through reading of the bio that everybody knows, but something which makes it a little bit more personal. And so I spoke about how, in college, I used to get the Times, Sunday Times, And there would be pieces that I clipped out to read later, and there would be eventually a stack of pieces, and how my son-in-law was a publisher in London, used his book to as a guide, almost, and thought about him as a mentor. And how I would recommend, I recommended his book about grammar to my children to read. And so I completed this little talk, and Harold Evans, who just passed away recently, I was sitting there at the table making little notes, as reporters do. And so he got up, and as he started, he responded to the points that I mentioned. And then he gave his speech. And afterwards, I brought a copy of his book up to him to autograph. And he said, you know, Mr. Schwartz, that was a very interesting introduction. It really was a very interesting introduction. It's only that when people introduce me, they usually talk about me instead of them. This is the point. If anybody was in the audience, they should be laughing. If you're not, I'm terribly sorry. So basically, we're getting towards the end of time. There may be a few more questions, but the important thing to remember is that the English-Speaking Union is an organization which can do good, and not only do good, but can also do good, not only do good internationally, but it also can do good for the members. There are benefits to belonging. Your life as a member of the ESU will be greatly improved if, in fact, you use it to meet other people and learn new things and take advantage of the resources that the ESU has. I've belonged for many, many years, and I've seen the ESU of interest to me, sometimes not of interest to me, but it's very important. Now, I've just got another one.
So I'll go ahead and dictate that one as well. It's from Eva J, who a comment saying, it's been a privilege to have had this opportunity to listen to you. You are certainly a credit to the ESU. Thank you for your time and sharing these memories.
And then her husband cut her off. I understand how this goes. I've been in oral argument in court. The judge always says, Mr. Schwartz, thank you for appearing. Goodbye. Thank you for this opportunity to the ESU.
Well, and just from me, Fred from the ESU at the National Office, thank you for agreeing and for taking the time to do this happy hour. I think it was definitely a change of pace, but also very interesting. So thank you again for taking the time. I'm now going to introduce our Executive Director of the English-Speaking Union at our national office, Karen Karpovich, to come on and say a few words. Karen, just go ahead and bring you on the screen.
Anyway, thank you, Fred, so much. It was an honor. It was an honor meeting you a few years back when we did our AGM in Washington, D.C. And you certainly do tell the story of our history and our past and our rich engagement with so many wonderful people. Thank you again. You, as the rest of all our members who've been around for 20 years and more, are our treasure. And I do thank you. I want to thank the Karen Blair brand and the Washington, D.C. branch for arranging this. And I think it was definitely a lovely event. And thank you again. And to Fred's point, you know, we're a membership organization, and please become a member, because there's a lot of great things, another 100 years of history that we still have to write. So we invite you to be part of that. Thank you again.